Well, welcome to Questioning Christianity, the channel helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. I'm Dan Patterson, and in this episode of our conversation series, I'm going to be talking with a Christian philosopher from the USA. Dr. Josh Rasmussen is a philosopher, and he teaches as an associate professor at Azusa Pacific University. This guy is a brainiac, and his big area is what we call metaphysics, or the biggest kind of fundamental questions when it comes to ultimate reality and who we are. Today I'm having him on to talk about his latest book, Who Are You Really?, which is a dive not just into identity, but into the richest parts of our human experience, particularly on the theme of consciousness, and whether or not our experience of consciousness is a good reason to believe in God. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and as always, if you love what we do here at Questioning Christianity, please do like and subscribe, click the bell for notifications on YouTube, and you can jump over to our social media accounts at QC Socials for a ton of bonus content. But for now, let's dive into the episode. Well, Josh, thanks for joining us here down under, at least digitally, all the way from the US. I think it's your first time on the channel, so really appreciate having you on.
Thank you. So great to be with you.
I've been actually watching your YouTube for the last couple of years. You've been putting out some great videos, sort of helping introduce people to big ideas and some of the concepts that you cover, certainly in your books. I've got a couple of your books here. I think the first one that I read from you from recommendation was How Reason Can Lead to God, and sort of this methodical step-by-step basis that people can follow to show a rational belief in God. But today we're going to pick up mostly on one of your latest books. People can see that here, Who Are You Really?, which dives into, oh, you've got a copy too? Great. But it's good, dives into the theme of sort of consciousness and more the bigger aspects of what are we as human persons? What are the different parts that make us up in our rich, deep human experiences? And so that's going to be fascinating. Before we dive into the content from your book particularly, I just wonder if maybe in a minute or two you may be able to spell out for people who haven't heard about you before or seen any of your story, a little bit about who you are, what your situation is, where you work, and maybe what got you interested in philosophy in the first place.
Thank you. Yeah. So my name is obviously Josh Rasmussen, and I teach philosophy at Azusa Pacific University. My interest in philosophy is an interest to try to understand things at the deepest level that I can. So I kind of got into philosophy because I had my own questions about my existence, about where I came from, my future. I was kind of worried in a way that life is sort of kind of fundamentally pointless in the end. Everything gets washed away. And yeah, like I wanted to know what was actually true, but I realized that truth might not correspond with my hopes. And so that sparked the question and the quest into philosophy. And I've kind of never looked back. I just want to understand, okay, what's the nature of me? What's the nature of the universe? How did things come to be? And so that's my passion. I was telling you before the show, I have a wife and 5 kids. And so they keep me busy and happy. And I feel like my purpose in philosophy is really to help equip others to see treasures by their own powers, by their own sight. And I think that's so important for people to see that they have powers to see things for themselves. So that is kind of my mission, to help others to also see kind of the nature of reality by their own powers.
Yeah, I like the tools that you actually spell out in the book, the tools that we have to be able to do that with introspection and reason, and we'll get to that a little bit later. It's funny having kids because you realize the work of philosophy is huge when you're raising little humans, and my kids seem to turn into thirsty philosophers who are afraid of the dark every time it's bedtime, and you find yourself having kind of deep conversations that often you feel entirely unprepared for. So I really appreciate reading philosophers like you, and we've had a couple on the channel, I think some of our most popular episodes, because people really do like to dive into these big questions and ask. I'm curious for you, obviously, who believes in God. So for some of my listeners, some of my friends who maybe don't believe in God, they're not Christians, they find the idea of thinking Christianity almost an oxymoron, that there's this idea of belief or having a relationship with God, which is based on faith, which they often think is some arcane feeling or spiritual currency or willful ignorance. And then there's good thinking and reason and rationality and philosophy over on the other side. I'm really be keen to hear what your experience with philosophy and then belief in God has been, and what that kind of relationship has been.
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, it connects with my own story, because for me, when I began to have sort of my own questions, my own doubts about kind of the nature of reality, one of my biggest worries was that crowds of people are sort of following other crowds of people based on feelings, based on desires and hopes, not really based on facing reality, looking at the evidence. And I think there is a kind of culture in a way. There's different, of course, streams of Christianity, but I think there are certain streams that emphasize the feelings, emphasize kind of maintaining certain beliefs rather than going out and exploring into the wilderness and sort of revising your beliefs, facing reality. And so I felt like that was inspiration for me to go and get to the truth about things and to really see, okay, what's actually true about the world. And what I discovered in my journey is that not all the beliefs that I inherited, not all the beliefs that the crowds of people around me kind of maybe take for granted are true. And I think that for me, a lot of my friends who are maybe more skeptical of the existence of God, I feel like oftentimes they're rightly pointing out that there are truths that are in reality that maybe we don't know yet or that go against some belief structures that we may
Mm.
inherit. So I love that and I value that so much. And I feel like because I love that so much, a lot of my work, and you can pick this up in my book, How Reason Can Lead to God, and then in my latest book on consciousness, I'm really trying to make observations and have a fresh analysis so everybody from all perspectives can come in and kind of check things for themselves.
Mm.
So I'm not assuming a package, I'm not assuming a framework, but I'm inviting each person to own their own journey, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love the way you write in that regard. In that, as someone who's not formally trained in philosophy but tries to dabble here there on the side, it's just been such a gift as a way in, as a non-professional, obviously, to be able to pick up the kind of big concepts that you're addressing in there. Well, before we dive into the conscious stuff, I'd love to just do a quick fire round with you, which is where we just get a few questions, get a bit more of a sense of where you are, and just get your thoughts on a couple of big topics. So you've got at most a minute to respond to these, a couple of sentences for each one, and we'll get through these quick. Josh, what's your favorite book and why?
Oh boy. Um, oh, this is too hard. And I only
You can
have a
you
few
can hate me
seconds to
later.
answer. Goodness sakes. I don't, one book that kind of surprised me, I discovered it, which I still love this book a lot, is How to Make Friends and Influence People.
Yeah,
Um, that book is a very special book to me. So I'll just put that up there for now
cool.
until a better book comes to my mind. A lot of great books, hard to decide.
What do you think is the best argument for
Yeah,
God or Christianity?
probably it's going to depend on the audience. I think my current favorite now is some kind of argument from consciousness that we'll probably be talking about in this book.
Stoked, because I've got that question later. What do you think is the hardest objection to answer for a Christian?
Probably some form of the problem of evil, and specifically some kind of version of animal suffering, because there are certain Christian theological views that I think make that problem, that question about animals around the world is suffering, particularly challenging, I think.
In the idea that they can have no recompense in eternity to be able to
Yeah.
alleviate that suffering. Yeah, yeah, I hope that's helpful. What's the argument that you wish atheists would stop using?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say something about all atheists, but let's see.
I'm thinking more of the
Yeah, the
unthinking
sort of
internet activist
popular.
types. Yeah.
I know. I mean, my challenge is that I sort of see value even in arguments that aren't so well put together. But one argument that comes up a lot, um, sort of on the internet, let's say, is sort of this argument against God from who created the creator kind of an argument. And I think part of it is that maybe if a theist who believes in God comes along and says, well, we need a God to create the universe, an atheist wants to say, well, I mean, if you think God is uncaused, nothing created God, then maybe the universe is also uncaused and uncreated. And there's sort of a way of pointing to that symmetry. But one way that that kind of comes out is just kind of through this argument from who created the creator. And I mean, I know that's a question, but that turns into an argument that
Mm.
basically, you're saying the creator is uncreated. If the creator, if the Christian God is uncreated, well, then, the universe could be uncreated. And so therefore the universe could be uncreated. And I guess that would be an argument that in my mind, I mean, I don't mind the argument. It's just that it's just such, it's not a good argument because, well, okay, I want to be careful with this. It's a good argument because it can invite some kind of curiosity, but the curiosity, I think, should focus in on what do you mean by God? The classical concept of God is concept of a supreme being that by its very nature would be uncaused.
Mm.
But there's nothing like that in the concept of the universe. It's not part of the classic concept of the universe that it has the kind of nature that once you understand its nature, you can sort of see that it would have to thereby be uncaused. That's why there's this open question about, is the universe caused? If it is caused, how could it be caused? Is it uncaused? That's an open
Mm.
question, precisely because it's not part of our concept of a cosmos that it have to be uncaused. It's just not built in. Whereas the classic concept of God does build in the concept of being supreme and uncausable. So that would be, I guess, my answer to this
Yeah.
argument that
Yeah.
maybe shouldn't appear so much. So
Yeah, I think it's a great
yeah,
question for kids to ask, and the way often it gets sharpened into an argument against Christianity, though, I think often misunderstands who Christians
I
believe
think
God
so.
is. Yeah.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to your 18-year-old self,
Oh, I love these questions.
other than invest in Bitcoin?
Yeah, right. Goodness, I think probably I would tell my 18-year-old self to just relax. Just enjoy life, enjoy each part. Um, don't feel like you have to achieve so much. You know, Although it's funny because I remember being 18 years old and somebody suggested something like that to me. And I remember at the time being annoyed by that. So I'm not sure my 18-year-old self would receive this message.
That's right. It's
So,
a different thing, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah.
What part of the Bible do you wish people wrestled with more?
Hmm. These are such good questions. Hmm. Maybe Genesis, maybe the first few chapters of Genesis, kind of wrestling with what's actually there on the text,
Mm.
not what maybe they've heard pastors say is there. Maybe what the pastors say is there is correct, but a lot of times we overlay theology onto the text. I mean, their text not even originally in English. I mean, it's in another language, another time, another culture, and to actually dig into some of those ancient words and wrestle with those first few chapters
Mm.
and think about maybe some different models for interpreting those texts, including models that maybe nobody has even developed to this day, because I think we assume so much from what we've heard, and we tend to kind of read our current views sort of back into our very interpretation of ancient texts. And so I guess I'd probably say that.
Yeah, it's a good one. I like that. What right now, so I know this changes with time and space, but what right now do you appreciate most about being a Christian?
I would say having a connection to a greater narrative of reality, that reality is unfolding according to a greater story, a greater purpose. And, you don't have to prove that you're good enough to be included into that story. It's a central theme of the Christian story that your actual preciousness is, first of all, secure in you being in the image of God. And then, second of all, your rightness with respect to God is freely offered as a gift, so it's not
Mm.
something you have to earn or achieve. And I find that to be a very inspiring message.
That's great, man. I really appreciate you being willing to face the speed run. I know it's hard to kind of put like short things, but it's just great to get a window
Very
into a bunch of
hard.
different
Yes,
areas
thank
in a
you.
person's life. So thank
Appreciate it.
you. Hey, well, let's
Well,
jump.
great.
For anyone who's just maybe clicked ahead, this is the book. Who are you? Really great question, I think, for us to be asking at this moment in our culture. Everyone wants to be thinking about big identity stuff and labels and where they fit and how they're meant to navigate the world and who they really are. And so I love the title of the book. It certainly drew me in when I saw it being advertised. I think your pre-release sort of stuff and wanted to dive in more. I also think what really surprised me about it is, we have this experience every morning of kind of waking up and in the Western world, at least looking into a mirror, and you never often stop to think deeply about who's staring back at you. And we have all of these experiences of our human lives, and we kind of travel through and try and survive and thrive and all of this. But to be able to take the time to consider, how do I make sense of these different features of my existence? I just really appreciate the time to slow down and spend some time with your book on that. I'd be curious what led you to write it in the first place.
I was inspired to write it when I was noticing that there's a lot of advances in our understanding of the nature of ourselves among the philosophers of mind, and I am seeing this in the empirical sciences as well. That these advances are just not well known in the popular sphere. I would have conversations with people about just the problem of explaining how there could be a conscious being integrated into a material system like a brain. And many times the responses displayed a very simplified picture about kind of what's at stake. One form of this would be that kind of what's at stake is, and again, this is kind of an impression I would get from the popular sphere, which is very different than I would get in sort of academic circles. But one kind of impression I would get in the popular sphere is that what's at stake is a kind of physicalistic, scientific vision of reality that science has uncovered versus a kind of sort of dualistic, spiritual, religious view of reality that maybe some Christian philosophers are trying to protect. And that way of sort of capturing almost like what's being debated is so different from my experience being in the field among the philosophers of mind. What I find in the philosophers of mind are philosophers who are coming into this question about who we are, how we could exist, not as religious, most of them not believing in God at all, but perplexed by how a being like us who can think and feel and choose could be situated into the world. And there are several different kinds of problems. The hard problem of explaining consciousness, the binding problem of seeing how different things come together to unified consciousness, a causal exclusion problem of seeing how we could consciously make a difference in the world without all of our actions being excluded by more fundamental mindless things at work. A problem of aboutness. How do thoughts get to be about things?
Yeah.
And philosophers working on this, again, they're not coming from religious viewpoints. Many of them are atheists, but they're arguing against a purely mindless first picture of reality. And then you have scientists like Donald Hoffman, for example, making arguments from empirical science against a purely mindless first vision of reality. And again, this these challenges are not coming out of like the Bible. They're not coming out of theological traditions. They're coming out of science and careful analysis of observations I think we can make
Yeah.
from within ourselves, that we can see that we're thinking beings, and we can then begin to deduce what does that imply. And so when I saw this divide between what I felt like the academics, the philosophers of mind are wrestling with, and then the way the popular sphere is discussing these things, I thought, I got to write about this. I got to talk about these problems. And I got to, these problems are coming out from careful analysis by these philosophers so that people can actually see that there are deep, deep treasures inside of you. I like what you said about sort of the mirror. It's very familiar. You know, you yourself are
Yeah.
a part of reality, but you almost don't see yourself. You just see the rest of the world. But the part of you that's able to see the rest of the world, that's a very significant part of reality. And so I wanted to write this book to help people to see the treasure of who they are in light of these challenges of explaining how something like you could exist on a mindless first vision of reality.
Yeah, and I like that because I mean, each chapter that you dive into, it touches on different experiences that we have, like our feelings, for instance, or our sense perceptions, or the notion of a will in choosing, our relationship to our bodies. And I mean, these are interesting discussions, and they're big and complex. And maybe some people, even hearing you dive in with some of the words and language and territory, might feel a little bit intimidated. But I like how you open the book actually with a degree of what's at stake. And so if you were to chat to someone and someone saying, well, I don't know whether I really want to think through these big questions. I don't really understand what the point is or what difference it makes. I don't know. How would you motivate them? What is at stake in your mind when it comes to
Like
different
everything
explanations for
is at stake.
consciousness?
Everything is at stake. Everything you could possibly care about is at stake. Because even your ability to care, that's caring is a state of consciousness. Okay. So this goal, the goal of the book is to understand what consciousness is and how beings who are conscious could arise in the first place, how we could come to exist. And so what I'm thinking is that what's at stake is everything that you could care about, because everything that you care about is filtered through experiences. The reason that you care that somebody died is that it has an impact on your experience. You have a feeling about them in your life, and you have a feeling about them being gone. These feelings are parts of consciousness. So that's kind of the first thing. Second thing that I draw out all the way to the end of the book has to do with your future. If you're the kind of being that can survive the scattering of molecules, then that opens up the possibility, and I actually argue at the end of the book, not just the possibility, but for the actuality of your continued existence after your body perishes. That you're not just your body, and you don't just depend upon your body. Your body facilitates certain kind of experiences, certain kinds of consciousness is facilitated by your body. So it's very important. Your body's important. But your existence doesn't depend on the particular arrangement of particular atoms. And so I think that is relevant to kind of how we think of our future. If we think that one day all our hopes and dreams come to an end and then there's no more awareness ever, forever and ever and ever, we might live differently. We might show up differently than if we believe that our lives do continue in some form, that we're not going to just be annihilated and go out of existence. So that's another thing that I think is at stake. There's more at stake, but those are a few
There
things.
is, and we can
Yeah.
probably dive into a few of those as we go as well. Coming back to that mirror image of who are we staring at? There's this beautiful line in 1 Corinthians where it speaks of looking through a glass dimly in terms of our knowledge of God and our relationship to God, and yet what to look forward to when we get to see Him face to face. For a lot of people, maybe when they come to a question like this, it's almost like they see through a glass dimly when it comes to understanding ourselves. Right? There's this distance, there's this fog of uncertainty. How do we make sense? But you speak about these tools in your book that we have as gifts to be able to try and make sense of these deep experiences of introspection and of reason. Do you want to unpack those a little bit for us?
We have these powerful tools to investigate who we are. So I talk about going into this cave of consciousness, which is a metaphor for this sort of investigation into who you are. So we're going into the cave and we're going to begin to explore the being that you are. And it's difficult to understand, how can we see in this dark cave? How can we look into our thoughts and find out what they are? So this is a question about knowledge. Where does knowledge even come from? Some people have a kind of, I would say, a limited view about how they get knowledge. They limit their tools to our 5 empirical senses of seeing with our eyes, hearing with our ears, or smelling or tasting or touching. And there's this idea that unless we can sort of test it with seeing, or maybe using a scientific instrument like a microscope to sort of extend our sight, unless we can do that, we can't really know about it. But then what that does is it cuts us off from 2 very important lights by which we can know all sorts of things in science. One is introspection. This is the light by which you can know that you're thinking, know that you're feeling something. In fact, without introspection, I don't even think you could even know that you have these other 5 empirical senses. Because the 5 empirical senses are senses that you sense by introspection, which is a 6th sense, you could call it. For example, if I'm having an experience now with my eyes of seeing pixels on a screen and seeing you smile so slightly and with a little bit of curiosity that I'm inferring. Well, the inferring, I use reason, right? And it's a probabilistic inference. But the knowledge that I was having an experience of seeing, the experience of seeing is not the same as what I'm seeing. So what I'm seeing is a pattern of shapes and colors. But the experience of seeing the shapes and colors, that's another kind of thing. That's not itself a shape or a color. So how do I know that I'm having the experience of seeing shapes and colors? That's through introspection. So introspection is a light that you need to even do science. To even, I make this argument in the book that implicit in reporting your observations is the knowledge that you made observations. Yeah. But how do you know that you made an observation? That's where you need this other power to be aware of yourself making an observation through introspection. And then reason is a power by which you can make deductions from your observations. And so this is a tool that allows you to extend your sight so that you can know that over in Jupiter, inside of Jupiter, you're not going to find those colorless, colorful aliens, because colorless, colorful things are impossible.
Yeah.
And so that's not going to exist anywhere, whether in Jupiter or anywhere else. And you can know that without visiting Jupiter. You can know that sitting in a chair, just using reason and saying, oh, okay, there can't be colorless, colorful aliens. That's just one obvious example. But there are other things I think that you can know by reason that are related to the question of the book. How could we exist? I think by reason, you can remove some impossible construction, some impossible theories of your existence. And then that narrows the range to the possible theories. Then the goal is to see, well, what within that range of possible theories could possibly produce you. You can only investigate that if you're using these tools of introspection and reason.
Yeah, and I love how those tools played out in the other book that I read for you as well. How reason can lead to God. Just kind of the way that you can sort out between competing ideas based on their merit using these different tools, and so it's really useful. Well, let's maybe explore some of the territory then. So someone who's watching this and like, yeah, I've got all these experiences, but what exactly is consciousness?
Yeah. So I want to start with just the general idea of an experience. I think of consciousness as just generally this state of experiencing. That's it. So if I have a state of experiencing a thought, that would be an example of like consciousness of a thought. The state of experiencing an intention would be, the consciousness of that intention. So experience itself is maybe another way of describing what consciousness is. But it's one of these things that's hard to define because it's so basic.
Mm.
What is consciousness? It's like, well, it's this familiar thing that we just know. I'm conscious. Like, oh, okay. How do you know that? Well, I'm conscious of my consciousness. That's
Yeah.
how I knew it. I used consciousness to know consciousness.
Yeah.
There's kind of a circularity here, So it's
Yeah.
because it's so bedrock to everything else, I think.
How far would you extend that then towards, let's say, animals, or even the potential of something like AI? Do you think that firsthand experience is something that we can measure in creatures that aren't like us?
So here, I think it's helpful to distinguish between the prospect of something making consciousness, so like AI producing consciousness, and then something having consciousness, so like chips, silicon chips, having the consciousness. This distinction is so important and it's often missed. For me, I would say that through my whole graduate um, time in studying consciousness and then making some contributions to the field, I myself didn't have this distinction clear even in my own mind between making consciousness and having consciousness. And this distinction is I need to make this to answer your question, because if I'm thinking about a computer and its connection to consciousness, I do think that computers can play a role in generating states of consciousness.
Mm.
In some ways, this is trivial because if somebody, right now, we're experiencing states of consciousness because of computers. Okay.
Yeah,
And
sure.
I'm having certain states of consciousness in response to pixels on a screen that are generated by a computer. So it looks like the computer is able to help facilitate or generate states of consciousness. But those pixels on the screen don't have the consciousness. The consciousness that they're generating is a consciousness that's generated in a being that's already capable of having consciousness. So, I mean, I make an argument in the book that I don't think that things in space are the kinds of things that can have the consciousness, but rather things in space can facilitate or be caught up in consciousness.
Okay.
So I do think that computers can play a role in generating consciousness as long as there's already a material or a substance that's capable of having consciousness. This is why I don't think that we'll be able to build conscious beings using chips from scratch. I think you already have to have a conscious being in place for technology to extend or to affect the consciousness that's already there, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
What about
So
animals then?
AI can extend. Yeah. So animals are a different case because I think that animals, if I look at a cat, I think what I'm looking at there is a representation of a deeper reality. So when I see the cat, I'm seeing a spatial representation of the kind of thing that is able to be conscious. So I think a cat is able to be conscious. So animals can be conscious. If I see your face, that face is representing you, and then you are the kind of thing that's able to be conscious. So yes, I do think animals
Okay.
can be conscious, and maybe even plants as well.
Well, that's cool. We may come back to that.
Yeah.
So I'm just getting big Avatar vibes. So let's think through the kind of territory then of different explanations of consciousness, right? Because we've got this firsthand experience and we're aware of it, and then we're trying to make sense of, okay, from where does this consciousness arise? What is the best explanation for how we can experience this? What would be if you could give maybe a spectrum of options? I know you do it in the book in a couple
Yeah,
of different
good.
places that might be helpful for people.
So I think it's helpful to maybe just divide all the options into three. So let me illustrate this. I've
Great.
got a Lego piece here, and this Lego represents a bit of reality. Okay,
Yeah.
now let's just say that somehow this bit of reality is related to some consciousness, and in fact, it is right. Like right now, it's related to my own experience of the Lego, so it is related to some consciousness. Okay, so now there's like three theories of how that could be. So one theory is we'll just call this the limitivist theory, which is the theory that actually there isn't consciousness. So its relation to consciousness is kind of actually a fiction. There is no actual consciousness. So there are no conscious thoughts or feelings of love or anything like that. And that might be kind of intuitive. Like you might think that if this were all of reality, then there would be no consciousness because you might think this is not the kind of thing that could be conscious. Okay, so that's illimitism.
Hmm.
A second theory would be reduction. So reduction would say that what it is to be conscious is to have certain other states, which then provide the basis for what that consciousness is. Okay, and what those other states are is going to depend on what you're reducing consciousness to. But to illustrate this, let's say that we want to consider the hypothesis that feeling love is the color green. Okay, is feeling love the color green? Well, the reductive hypothesis would be this one would be that love is that color green. And I actually think that we can know firsthand, using the tool of introspection, that the feeling of love is not the color green. And the way this works is that we can directly compare within our own conscious awareness two things: the color, which we can have direct, I think we can have
Yeah.
direct experience of the color, and then the feeling of love. And then we can see directly, as surely as true is not false, and triangle is not square, feeling love is not the same as being green. So that's a way of testing that reductive hypothesis.
Yeah.
But then I think we can use that same test to test other reductive hypotheses, even the hypothesis that the conscious being just is a not just a color, but let's say a set of shapes or a configuration of brain matter, some kind of brain activity. I think it's possible to use that same direct comparison test to know that, and this is controversial, but I mean, I'm going to stand by this. I argue for this, that you can know, and you have to do the work to know this. Like, I can't just give you the argument. You have to like notice yourself having a feeling, notice that you're not noticing a brain states, then use the law of identity that if you're noticing a feeling, but you're not noticing brain states, then there's something true of the feeling that's not true of brain
Mm.
states. Namely, feeling is an object of your noticing. The brain states are not. And then we can make some distinctions to show why this is different than thinking that water and H2O are different, because in the case of water and H2O, you don't have direct awareness of the molecular structure, but you do have direct awareness of your experience of water. So in fact,
Yeah.
that's how you can know that your
Yeah.
experience of water is not the same thing as the
So with this
molecular structure.
reductive category, then is this the notion that sort of consciousness is a higher function that effectively emerges from the combination of lower states?
So then this leads to theory three. So theory three would say, you know what, the consciousness isn't the same thing as those lower states, but it arises from. I like how you put that. It comes from, or it depends on, or emerges from lower states.
Yeah.
And basically, what I would say is that the arguments against the first two theories, against eliminating consciousness, there is no consciousness, reducing consciousness, leads to this third theory that consciousness sort of emerges out of lower level mindless states. And at this point, what I want to offer is a further distinction between the idea that the material that consciousness arises out of is itself composed of mindless bits of matter versus the material out of which consciousness arises is another kind of thing entirely. I have a chapter on the self, and I
Yeah.
talk about this material or a substance that I call self, which I think you can actually witness within in self awareness. It's a different kind of material. And so I think sometimes people think that emergence is sort of an enemy of maybe the view that I would want to argue for, which is the view that you are a piece of reality that can have consciousness that doesn't emerge out of mindless bits of matter. But I want to kind of reframe this and just say, well, there are two kinds of emergence. There's the emergence out of mindless bits of matter, and then there's the emergence out of you, the being, right? And so, what I would argue is that there are problems with getting consciousness out of mindless matter that can be solved if we say instead the consciousness comes out of you, that you are a piece of reality, and that you yourself don't emerge out of mindless matter either, but
Sure.
instead you are a different kind of being.
Well, let's tease that out a little bit because I think maybe the more we talk around this, the more some images might be kind of useful for people. So it seems like that first category, the eliminative one, which is effectively, would you say consciousness is illusory in that regard? No one really possesses any kind of consciousness.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not sure many people would just naturally drive with that, but it's certainly been popular over the decades. And you mentioned the popular level conversation to say that we can explain, let's say, the mind or consciousness simply by reference to the biological organ, the brain, and that
Yes.
the mind just is these brain states.
Yeah.
That's probably been a relatively popular, like naturalistic explanation. No need for other immaterial stuff or for God or supernatural explanations or anything like that. Would you say you're noticing in philosophy of mind a move away from that view of matter first to potentially this concept of mind first with these philosophers of mind and developments in neuroscience?
Yeah.
What would be your observation?
Yeah. Yeah. Two things. So first, most philosophers of mind who work on this don't think that you can explain the first person experiences of consciousness purely in terms of mindless matter. That's actually a majority view. You can't explain it in the sense, and here by explain, I mean that just by understanding all the positions of the matter and how it's moving, you can now see that there would be conscious states
Yeah.
emerging out of that. You can't explain that. So then this leads to a kind of interesting divide. So some philosophers say, well, we can't explain that. There's a kind of explanatory gap, but that's okay. I mean, every theory is going to have, let's say, explanatory primitives, things that
Yeah.
just aren't explained. So we just kind of have to live with that. Other philosophers say, well, let's try to minimize our explanatory mysteries as much as possible. Here's a way that we don't have to just have a brute sort of leap from mindless matter to this kind of consciousness is if the consciousness is itself deep into reality and is in fact fundamental. And so a number of philosophers, Philip Goff, Castro, even David Chalmers, who coined the term
Mm.
hard problem of consciousness, thinks that there's some kind of fundamental aspect of consciousness, some kind of qualitative aspect that's sort of fundamental. It's not explained or derived in terms of more fundamental categories. And so, yeah, there does seem to be an interesting trend. This is kind of anecdotal, but I don't know of any philosophers who've worked in the field of the philosophy of mind who, in the course of their work, in the course of their career, have moved in the other direction where they came in thinking that mind is sort of fundamental or primary. And then through studying the philosophy of mind, they're like, ah, no, it looks like mind emerged out of
Yeah.
mindless bits of matter. I don't know philosophers who've taken that journey. Maybe there are some, but it's not a common journey for philosophers. And I'm talking about those who've begun working into the field, because sometimes before you get into the field, you make a journey one way or the other, but then you go into the field. And a lot of philosophers I know come into the field as naturalists, atheists, mindless first theorists. Philip Goff, he's got an interesting story where he, in college, kind of worked himself kind of through thinking about things to a position where atheism is true. The mindless particles are the kind of the fundamental actors. Everything comes out of that. And he kind of arrived from that analysis at the view that consciousness itself can't really be real. It can't really be there in the brain. It doesn't really make sense for images of purple dragons to be literally rotating like inside your brain. That's not really there, right? The feeling of love, like it's not really there inside the brain. I mean, if you look in the brain, you've got gray matter. You just got stuff that's in space, but you don't have these other categories in there. And so there's different ways of understanding that. But and according to his story, he was listening to some music and he actually became convinced that no, that feeling of the music is real. He was sort of struck by it is real, and this set him on a path that you see in his work as a philosopher of mind now in his career as a philosopher, to thinking that maybe consciousness is actually deeper in to the nature of reality. It doesn't emerge out of the mindless bits of matter, but it's its own category. So he talks about consciousness being a kind of intrinsic aspect of things, and that the physics is sort of describing the extrinsic or relational aspects of things. And I find that very interesting because, he's telling a story where he's going from being skeptical that there is consciousness to thinking, no, there is consciousness, and the only way it could exist is if it's in some way fundamental.
Well,
Peter
I mean, oh, sorry, you go.
Yeah, there's just many examples I could multiply of philosophers who've taken this path
Yeah.
towards thinking that mind is deeper in.
And you've always got to be careful diving into a field that you're not importing your own assumptions or just looking for evidence to justify a position that you already hold, but you genuinely are open to changing your mind. And so with this next question, as someone who believes in God and comes into a field with philosophy, and it could be very easy simply to try and justify, there has to be something else, some big consciousness, some mind first sort of principle. But given the observations that you're describing of people who started more like where Philip Goff did and have ended up with various versions of this mind first, or at least fundamental aspect of consciousness and reality, would you see that as some kind of convergence then between the field of philosophy of mind and discoveries of neuroscience then with more of a biblical anthropology, which says that we're more than just earthy, dusty creatures? There are other aspects to our reality. Where would you want to start tying in this conversation with the Christian story and what it teaches about humanity?
I think one could certainly draw that connection. I was going to mention Peter Unger. He kind of was earlier in his career doubting that he exists. And I think philosophers come to this place. I think a lot of people think, philosophers, of course you have to be a philosopher to doubt that you exist. But I think what's really going on here is that the philosophers are seeing that there are these challenges of seeing how the real you, that self, that feeling of being you, if that were real, it's hard to see how that could be made out of just the mindless particles interacting. And I think they're seeing that, they're understanding that to a point. And so he ended up later in his career turning it around and then thinking, no, I do exist, and then making an argument that his existence isn't going to be explained in terms of the physics. So he's deeper in. And I like to give these examples because, like you said, there is a kind of worry that if you start with a conclusion that you like, you're going to kind of cherry pick and find the evidence that leads to that conclusion. But these guys, Peter Unger, Philip Goff, Kastrup's another one. I mean, he still would call himself a naturalist. He's not coming at this as a theist looking for arguments to support his view. Now, in my case, it's maybe a little bit different because although in How Reason Can Lead to God, I tell my story of losing belief in God and then finding certain paths of reason and science that restored, I would say, kind of a bigger picture of reality that I would describe as a theistic, with theistic language, that God is at the base of reality. My thoughts about consciousness are, in a sense, guided by these other parts of my worldview, and of course I'm a human being, and it is sort of exciting in a way. It's like, it looks like there's this evidence over here that points to something that I have other reason to think is true. And so, there is that connection there, but I think it is a real connection, and you don't have to start believing in God to find these pathways to the conclusion that mind is fundamental or mind is first. This is exactly the picture of reality that this sort of biblical Christian worldview would describe, that
Yeah.
um, there's a supreme being and it has supreme intelligence, and this being is primary. It comes first in the order of reality, and
Yeah.
everything else comes after that.
Yeah. There have been some attempts, though, obviously, to explain the mind first or fundamental mind aspect of reality, something like panpsychism, without reference to theism necessarily, the idea of a transcendent creator God. Uh, how would you sharpen this experience of consciousness then maybe into an argument for God's existence?
Sure. So there's maybe two sides to this. So one side is maybe a translation side. So I think sometimes what happens is people will be describing God, but they'll be using words that, even according to their own kind of associations of what they think God means, they don't think they're describing God. But if you have kind of a broader concept of God, you can sort of see how, oh, actually, they're already there. I had this experience in a dialogue book with a philosopher, Felipe Leon, and the book is called "Is God the Best Explanation of Things?" And we were exploring this. He was taking the non-theist position, I was taking the theist position, and so we were having a dialogue, chapter after chapter. And what was interesting to me is he began to describe the nature of fundamental reality in a way that I thought it would be sufficient for a kind of minimal theism, a
Mm.
minimal statement that this is God. I mean, he began to describe it as being, first of all, uncaused, fundamental, transcending space and shape, transcending um, what we might call physical reality. It has a power to finely tune the universe for life. It has even a kind of intentionality. He
Mm.
called it a natural intentionality, but this is like a power to intend. It has some kind of quality of consciousness that's fundamental. He was granting even that.
Yeah,
It
wow.
has value, right? It has principles of reason built
Yeah.
into it.
It's like all
And
the
I'm thinking,
attributes
okay,
basically of.
yeah. And then kind of toward the end, there was a question, well, is it purely good? Right. And so then he
Mm.
had the problem of evil, and so we had that conversation. Um, but it's already kind of describing what I would probably want to call God.
Mm.
Kastrup says he's okay using the term God, even though he would in other contexts say it's natural, it's not supernatural, but he's going to use the term God. And so part of the challenge is that these words are the words are tricky. Like our concepts
Yeah.
are tricky. We come into these fields with certain concepts. So that would be actually one thing that I would do with the panpsychists is actually kind of talk about um, whether even in their own terms God exists, but maybe they're just describing it differently.
Mm.
So Philip Goff's view, I think, is like this. I would say Philip Goff counts as a theist now, according to the way that I think of things, because he thinks that fundamental reality is conscious. He's even willing to say that it's wholly good. And he has some qualms about saying that it's unlimited in power. And so he has this concept of God that it's intelligent, wholly good, and unlimited in power. And so
Mm.
therefore, he's an atheist because he doesn't think that that exists, right? But okay, but even when you say limits to power, I mean, because Christian is going to say, well, God is limited by the possible, at least. God
Yes,
can't do
the logic of
impossible
his own
things.
mind. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So even there, we can start to clarify. But then there's this question about for the panpsychists. There's usually this challenge, and this is the second thing that I want to say is that I think we can go further than just mind is fundamental to make an argument that the nature of this mind would have some of these characteristics that we might associate with God. So just to draw this out a little bit more, there's this problem, this binding problem that many panpsychists face. And this is the problem of seeing how little conscious bits could come together to form a unified conscious reality. So, and I talk about this in the book, even if we could solve the hard problem of building conscious chips out of unconscious mindless atoms, there's this further question about how you can organize these chips into a single being
Yeah.
that can be conscious of all those together. So this is the binding problem. And panpsychists face this problem because if you're a panpsychist, you think that fundamental reality has consciousness, bits of matter have their own bits of consciousness. How do those things organize to form you, a unified conscious being? How do they organize to form me? So Goff's, he's got an answer that's so fascinating to me. He suggests that, well, maybe The foundational reality is a whole that exists prior to its parts, and it has, as a whole, a unified consciousness prior to the parts. Well, now I'm thinking this is a solution to the binding problem that takes us closer to a classical theistic picture,
Mm.
where the foundational reality is a personal being, a whole being, and then you say that the elements are parts of it, but the whole exists prior to the parts. What that means is that those parts, because we tend to think of the parts as existing prior to the whole. We think that these Legos exist and then we put them together to form a complex
Yeah.
thing that depends on the parts existing first. But if the whole can exist prior to the parts, then you could sort of reconceive things where the whole is the foundational, uncaused reality. It's not caused by its parts. It causes or grounds its parts to exist. And so, this is looking more like a theistic version of panpsychism, if that makes sense, because you have the base of reality as conscious, but that base reality is a whole that's prior to its parts. It's a single being, a single unified consciousness
Yeah.
that then can create other conscious beings within itself. And I think that's completely consistent with the sort of broad theistic vision of reality, because it's been a debate among theists. What is God's relationship to creation? And I would say it's sort of an open question whether the creatures are in some sense in God, parts of God. We aren't the same thing as God. God is prior to the parts, but I think that is something that's within
Yeah.
theism already, if that makes sense.
Totally. Could we like play off that analogy a
Yeah,
little
go
bit of
for
the whole
it.
existing and then the parts kind of converging? So, I mean, one of the big things that people maybe leads a lot of people to suspect a more reductive view of things, that we are the sum of our parts, and that's the only thing that allows higher consciousness to kind of to emerge, rather than this mind first thing. So, when I was young, we had a big car accident. My mum sustained heavy head injuries as a result of that. Her brain was damaged, and so that had big effects on things like personality and brain chemistry and memory and these sorts of things. And so the way in which an injury to the brain leads to a shift in personality or expression or abilities, and that's what leads a lot of people just to assume that there is a direct connection, obviously, between the brain and the mind or the person or the conscious being as a whole. How would you, on this analogy of you've got the thing first but then the parts come up, how would you want to make sense of what happens in a scenario like that?
I think of brains as controllers that facilitate consciousness. So Paul Kysick coming at this, he's a brain scientist. He's not coming at this question from a religious point of view or from a theistic or even from a mind first point of view. I think
Yeah.
he would probably be a mindless first theorist. But I think his model of the brain is spot on. It's scientifically adequate and it makes a lot of sense of my own analysis of consciousness. So he thinks the brain is a device that allows you to facilitate consciousness in response to the environment. So if a tree falls and it's far away, then maybe you're not in danger, but if it's closer, then you're in danger. And so you're going to have different conscious experiences depending on how far the tree is. And so he argues that brains sort of evolve to help over time to help you to survive in the wilderness of life. And they facilitate conscious experiences. So that facilitation of conscious experiences opens up the model that I offer, which is that you don't depend for your existence on the brain,
Yeah.
just as you don't depend for your existence on these computers working. But these computers working are facilitating certain conscious experiences. Like you couldn't access what I'm saying to you right now unless the computers are facilitating that through technology. It's allowing you to have conscious experience with a set of thoughts. But you don't depend on the computers working in order for you to have in order for you to exist. You depend on the computers working for you to have certain conscious experiences. So I think
Yeah.
it's the same with brains. That's why if brains die as they're deteriorating, you lose access to certain experiences that those brains are giving you access to. And then if you completely die and the brain is completely destroyed, well, now the question is, can you access anything? Right? That's the question. And then there, it's quite interesting that first, I have an argument in the book that your spirit can't be destroyed because there's a kind of destruction problem. But also, you have people who come back from having the experience of dying in these near death experiences. And many of them report that their consciousness increased when when their brain was sort of offline and they were then detached from the brain. People who are blind from birth having the experience of seeing in color for the first
Wow.
time during their near death experience. There are a number of cases like this. Now, I don't rest my arguments in this book on any of those cases, but I think the cases, what they do, whatever you think about those cases, they highlight a certain model where the brain is facilitating consciousness in this environment. So it's kind of like if you're playing a game and you have an avatar in the game. While you're connected in the game, you're experiencing things through that avatar in the game. But then once you leave the game, well, then now you're no longer constrained by the rules of that game. Now you can have other consciousness outside the game. Um, so it's kind of like if you get immersed, you put on a headset and you're fully immersed in the game, then all your experiences are immersed by the game. And the things that happen to your headset are going to affect your experiences in the game. But it doesn't mean that if the game is destroyed, you are destroyed. It just means that in the game, you're having certain experiences facilitated by the brain.
So, would you be comfortable sort of using that language then of a soul or a spirit in terms of describing the
Yeah,
center of human consciousness?
I would. My only reservation is just that the word soul and the word spirit just have these associations.
Yeah,
And I'm kind of accustomed to talking with philosophers who are atheists and maybe associate souls and spirits with
with religious concepts.
untechnical, yeah, religious things. And it's like while they're against souls, they are self-aware. They're not against themselves having thoughts. They're aware. I think you can be aware of yourself having thoughts. And I think yourself, the self that you're aware of when you're aware of yourself having thoughts, is just what I mean by the soul or the spirit, depending on how you want to put these terms. But yeah, so as long as I clarify what I mean by that, then
Yeah.
yes, you have a spirit. It doesn't depend on your brain. It survives the destruction of your brain.
Yeah. I wanted to get your thoughts on something as a result of this kind of shift, I guess, to the mind first explanation.
Yeah.
So Graham Oppy, who I know is a wonderful philosopher of religion, I know you've interacted with him in the past with discussions, but his bag, the best argument against God was sort of an argument from simplicity, that naturalism is the best explanation for fundamental reality. Given this sort of observation of consciousness then, and maybe some of the shifts, do you think then that is a point against his argument of the simplicity of naturalism to be able to account for all of reality? Do you think this is maybe one more in the favor of theism on that regard? I'd be curious to get your perspective.
I love the question. I think it certainly could be. I mean, initially, if Graham Oppy is watching this, he might be thinking that, well, no, I mean, simplicity is a point against the person who's positing souls and spirits. It would be simpler to analyze everything in terms of what we know. And we know there's natural reality. We know there's atoms and we know that there's fields and we know that there's bodies. And so if we can analyze everything in terms of what we know, that's going to be the simpler view. But it's also interesting. This is why I like the question, because many of the people who are arguing for a mind first view are making an argument from simplicity. They're saying, hey, you know what? Among the things we know, sure, we know that there are atoms, we know there are rocks and trees, but we also know that we know. We know that there are knowers, that there's beings, okay, that there's knowledge. We know that there's knowledge, and knowledge belongs to beings, right? We know that we exist. And so now there's an open question whether we can analyze the things that are in physics in terms of the categories that we know about in consciousness. Just to highlight one example of a project, Donald Hoffman has an article called Objects of Consciousness. It's a co-author with another scientist, and um, they give it an analysis of basic aspects of physics in terms of more fundamental aspects of consciousness. So what they're doing there is they're analyzing known categories in terms of other known categories. And part of the motivation for this is that you actually can have a simpler view of the world if you can analyze known categories in terms of known categories than if you have to posit things that are unknown, if you posit extra complexities. And so the way this works is kind of the way that I think about it is that if you start with a mindless first view, then you have to posit in addition to atoms and see, how do I want to say this? You want to posit in addition to the known categories of atoms and mental states and an analysis of the atoms in terms of mental states, because there's ways that we can provide that analysis of the properties of atoms in terms of prior mentality. You have to posit in addition these unknowable gaps, explanatory gaps between the atoms and then the emergence of the consciousness. We don't have a way of seeing how merely moving atoms around in a certain way, by moving them in that way, you would have a conscious being who can smell coffee. But we do have analysis that goes the other way, where we can understand the aspects of shape of atoms and the properties of atoms in terms of underlying consciousness. And I mean, and that's where Hoffman's work in the objects of consciousness draw that out. They draw out that analysis. So you have an argument from simplicity for a mind
Yeah,
first.
yeah. I think that could be an interesting conversation between the two of you for a future episode on
I
someone's
would
channel.
love that. Yes.
That'd be
Have us
cool.
on your show. We can talk it out. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he is here in Australia, so we punch above our weight every now and again in certain things, mostly in sport and surviving deadly animals. But hey, I just wanted to ask one last question, if you don't mind. On the implications for this when it comes to things like determinism and free will, because this is a huge, I think, aspect. And you're talking before about the stakes, what's at stake in a conversation around consciousness. And certainly everything from morally praiseworthy and blameworthy to justice to meaning, all of these to some degree seem to be wrapped up with the notion that we have a degree of agency. But this is an incredibly complex conversation, because you've got deterministic philosophers, both on the theistic and on the naturalist side, who think that human beings don't really have any meaningful agency. You've got compatibilists in the middle, but you've got even questions of those who, let's say, sort of the Sam Harris types, which would say, yes, with everything's determined, but even if it was indeterminate, then it would be entirely random, because you have no control over what thoughts come to your mind.
Right.
And so even if you posit consciousness and a degree of freedom, you're not free to choose the content of the thoughts that pop into your mind. So there's all of these sort of features around. I'm curious to get your take on the freedom question, because I know there's an entire chapter in the book on that. I really appreciate you wandering through that. But for the sake of our listeners, is free will real, and how does your concept of consciousness play into that?
I just talked about this in my classes. We have a whole section on free will.
Great.
And we talked exactly about what you just described there, about sort of this problem of either everything we do is determined by, let's say, particles pulling the strings. People are puppets of particles, and the string pullers are the particles. And so we're not actually free because we're completely determined. Or you put in indeterminism, and that's just randomness. Indeterminism is just where you have an event that could go one way or go another way, and nothing determines which way it goes. I mean, look, if there's an event in my brain and nothing determines it, then I don't have any control over that event. Then I'm just a puppet of indeterministic event, right? Yeah. And I think what this reveals a deep, deep puzzle about how we could possibly have free will. I came across, I think it was like a TED Talk, where the guy very eloquently raised this puzzle as a reason to upgrade our belief from thinking naively that we have free will to now knowing that free will is an illusion. There's no way we can actually make choices, make a difference in the world. And it's precisely because of this problem of us being puppets of the particles. But here's my answer to this. First, I think that the puzzle comes from a paradigm. And the paradigm is the mindless first paradigm. So when people talk about free will, there are two conditions that many philosophers think are necessary for free will. First, there's the source condition, which is basically that the agent has to be a source of their actions.
Yep.
And then second, there's a kind of alternative possibilities condition, that you can choose between alternatives. But put the alternative possibilities condition to the side for now, because you might think that determinism is a threat to the alternative possibilities. Determinism means there's only one way things could go. But remember, we said that even if it's not determined, you have these random events in your brain, you still don't have freedom. And that's because the source condition, that the agent is the source of the cause of her actions, that's being threatened by the mindless first paradigm,
Mm.
whether determinism is true or not, whether you have alternative possibilities or not. As long as you aren't the one pulling the strings, you aren't the source of your actions.
Yeah.
Mindless bits of reality are. But if you flip the paradigm, and instead of assuming that the mindless is first, the mindless is the fundamental, you say, what if my mental beings, beings that have minds, conscious beings, what if they are primary actors in the world? What if I actually have a power to make a difference in the world? Then we can restore that source condition. The
Mm.
source condition is not threatened. So the way this works is that I am determining events in my brain. I'm causing quantum states to ripple, affecting particles in my brain, leading to my actions. And nothing that's mindless is making me do that. I'm the one making myself do that for certain reasons, and we can kind of
Mm.
spell out this in more detail. But I think we can pull out a root of a problem for free will just by flipping the mindless first theory to a mind first theory. Then the question is, well, but how do you know you actually have free will? And very briefly, I think there are many ways of getting evidence for free will, but I think the most direct way is just to notice yourself in self awareness, deliberating between options, and then deciding.
Mm.
I actually think that self awareness of yourself making decisions gives you acquaintance with the reality of yourself making decisions. And I mean, and this is why it takes so much time talking about those tools to know things from within and try to respond to various objections to those tools. Because once you can realize, no, you can know that you have thoughts and feelings and that you are the one, you are having thoughts and feelings. That means you're self aware. You're aware of a you. That's not an illusion. Once you have that, that opens up the door to having the awareness of yourself making choices. And then you have the scientific evidence that I think confirms this from the outside. There's a lot of interesting recent work about the power of consciousness to affect material systems, to affect your brain health. There's work in positive psychology. There's work, more cutting edge work, even about sort of like the quantum field being affected by your intentions and this being measured. We can like measure the impact of intending to do something in your brain. So I don't think the science rules out free will, but actually measures from an outside perspective what you can notice right within. And then if that's right, then you have an interesting argument from free will for a mind first theory of reality. The
Yeah,
argument
sure.
would just, if reality is fundamentally mindless, you wouldn't be the agent of your actions because you would be a puppet of mindless things. You are an agent of your actions. You can notice this directly by seeing yourself make actions from within. Therefore, reality is not mindless first. And I do think that's a sound argument. I think its premises are knowable. You can verify them for yourself through your own direct conscious awareness.
I really appreciate that. And again, I think that's another episode that maybe I'd love to have
Absolutely.
sometime. I know the big conversations sort of for particularly a lot of secular thinkers that really struggle to jump over this, starting with that sort of mindless first paradigm. So it's been so good being able to have you on here for an hour and just throw a ton of questions your way. I really do hope people pick up a copy of the book, Who Are You Really? You can find that on all good book distributors online and check that out. It's worth doing. And I know you've got some other interviews if they want more of a primer. If people do want to follow you online, see some more of your work, where are some places that they can go?
Thank you. You can get free resources on my website, which is joshuarasmussen.com, or just type into Google worldview design, and you'll hopefully be able to find my YouTube channel. I've got a worldview design kind of website where people can connect with each other. So yeah, worldview design would be the place to go.
So great. And just a parting question that we have for all of our guests. If there was someone watching this video that made it right to the end, well done, and they just were exploring Christianity, what would be a parting message that you would want to leave with them?
Start with your own self, the things that are the most familiar to you, maybe your own existence, and consider how a being like you could arise, and consider what story of reality, there are different stories of reality, but what story of reality might make the most sense of you existing in the world. And that might lead you to a view that is different than my own interpretation of reality, but I think it could lead you to a view that could be quite inspiring. And I think that what inspires me about the Christian story is that it does provide a narrative structure of reality that makes sense of the existence and the value of conscious beings. That our value doesn't hinge on the color of our skin or the shape of our body or a pattern of neurons, but it hinges on something more intrinsic. I would say it hinges on our very nature as conscious beings, as spiritual beings, and that spiritual nature makes sense in terms of a certain narrative structure of reality. So I would say that would be my sort of parting thought or invitation for those
Yeah,
listening.
it's a super helpful one. Well, we'll make sure, Josh, that we put all the links to your YouTube channel, particularly, but also to your website and to anything else in the show notes. People can just check down below the video to find that. Just want to say thanks so much for being willing to come on the channel and share your thoughts on your new book.
Thank you. It's been so much fun. Appreciate it.
Look forward to doing it again sometime. Thanks. Well, congratulations on making it all the way to the end. That was a great episode. Loved that conversation with Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. If you've got any more questions, you can send them in through our website at questioningchristianity.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please do like and subscribe on YouTube and jump over to our social media channels at QC Socials on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, in order to be able to get a ton of bonus content. As always, the truth invites questioning, and I hope you enjoyed this episode.